Okay, hi, my name is David Mannock, and in this video, I would like to introduce a series of messages I just began as Salem Ecclesia on the subject the theologians call eschatology, or eschatological study is a sub-discipline of theology where theologians wrestle with the idea of end times, or how the Bible depicts the consummation of the human history, and by implication, how does God wrap this all up? If God is righteous, we can ask a basic question: how will all this be made right? What began in Genesis and so forth. So eschatological study is a very dense theology, and it's got a lot of landmines, as evidenced by a historical review of eschatology. So in seminary, we used to say young preachers should preach simple sermons because you don't want to spend the rest of your life defending what you said. Well, since I've been in the pastoral ministry 45 years, I'm going to walk out into the minefield. All right, so this is fun for me, and I have so far 277 slides on my PowerPoint, and when I'm finished, more than likely it's going to be about 400. So it's a very dense theological study, and so generally speaking, what I would like to do is introduce that study, and you can go on Salem Ecclesia website or YouTube channel and see the messages so far, okay? And the table of content looks something like this. In the PowerPoint, you see me introduce myself, a little bit of my background, which is twofold. One in the area of theology, one in this area of psychology, since I'm dual trained with 3 graduate degrees. Then I'm looking at 2 key gospel passages, Matthew 24 and Mark 13. And the 2 are considered one of the 2 critical chapters to get us into how does all this consummate. And then I introduced the discipline of eschatology itself, and then out of necessity I have to spend a little time deconstructing dispensationalism, because that is a standard theological concept and modality that most Christians, Protestant and Catholic, have been taught regarding how to look at the future. And dispensationalism, as it developed and evolved through the 1800s and 1900s, and it's what I hear constantly from Christians. And I have to try to take that apart, because dispensationalism doesn't help us to understand how the whole thing is going to be consummated from the biblical perspective. And then I did a section on the gospel to remind us that the good news is God's redemptive action in history and the story of that. So I reviewed the gospel, and then I shifted to N.T. Wright, one of my favorite New Testament theologians, because his worldview about the Bible, about the New Testament world and Scripture itself, and his deconstruction of how the Greeks skewed our perspective of reality, and that lends itself into dispensationalism and so forth and so forth. N.T. Wright has done a brilliant job. Then I'm going to switch to Charles Yu, a young Old Testament theologian who has a wonderful macro view, and through Charles Yu, I'm going to focus on the ancient rebellion If you want to know how God's going to make all things right and how the end of human history is a consummation point, we have to go back to the beginning and ask a basic question. What happened? And how did we get off track? And how's God going to put us back on track? Charles Yu helps us. Then I have to switch to something very dense. I have to walk us through some good enough cliff note kind of orientation on ancient Near East history. Because when you read the New Testament writers who's stunned by the resurrection and they're scrambling like crazy and they're going back to the Old Testament to make sense of all the New Testament writers believe Jesus arose. There's no question. They're confident about that, but they're trying to make sense. What does that mean? And how does that shift? And they go back to Jewish roots. And in going back to Jewish roots, they are forced to read the literature that the Jewish people in ancient times read. That corresponds to Babylonian, Assyrian, Egyptian literature. And you can find those imports and shadows in the Old Testament, and you can find them in the New Testament. So, the Old Testament did not grow in isolation. It's like if someone asked me, tell me about America in World War II, I would have to talk about Germany, England, Russia, Japan, the Philippines, right? There's no way to isolate. And that's a classic mistake Christians make. It's hard enough to understand Old Testament. My goodness, what is it saying? It's even harder to put it into context. Okay? And then I'm going to suggest that we have an existential component, because we as Christians, in marching through time and space, being eyewitnesses, participating, partnering with God as He brings human history with His divine salvation acts to completion, we realize we are in between people, meaning the first advent, Jesus was born. Bethlehem, incredible incarnation, intervention. And then His promise He will return. So we're in between first and second advent. The best way I can describe it is we're kind of like World War II soldiers. We have D-Day, successfully have landed in Normandy. Now we're on the march to V-Day, D-Day to V-Day. You got 2 days. The same way we got 2 advents. The first coming and the second coming. And none of how God's going to consummate this stuff can it be understood if you don't existentially hold the position. We're in between. We're marching towards something. And then I'm going to shift us to Bible Project, a wonderful group of scholars and Christians up in Portland who have on their website all kinds of wonderful YouTube clips on various subjects. And I'm going to pick up what they say about Son of Man, about exile, and so forth, because they're key concepts about the end time. Then I'm going to shift to Michael Heiser, who I believe is a brilliant Old Testament theologian with a clear understanding of Near East history in its context. And he is going to wrestle with us, helping us to think about the end times with a particular key concept, tribulation, because that's like a benchmark concept. And then I'm going to shift to Harold Everby, who has a study on victorious eschatology. Not that I fully agree with him, but I think he's done a solid job. All right, catch your breath.